Ryan Gosling stood in the first-class check-in line at LAX, dressed in faded jeans, a simple t-shirt, and worn sneakers. He carried just a small backpack on his shoulder, hardly the image of a high-rolling traveler. Most people around him were too busy juggling designer luggage or typing furiously on their phones to pay him any mind. But one person, a sharply dressed man named Connor, couldn't help but stare. Connor wore a tailored suit, polished loafers, and a watch that likely cost more than some cars. He radiated an air of certainty that the world should cater to him. Spotting Ryan in the same line, he raised an eyebrow as though something was off. For a moment, he said nothing, only narrowed his eyes at Ryan's casual appearance. When they finally shuffled forward, Connor cleared his throat. "This is the first-class line," he muttered, just loud enough for Ryan to hear. Ryan offered a polite smile. "Yes, it is." Connor tilted his head. "Of course," he replied, voice dripping with condescension. "You, traveling alone?" Ryan nodded, stepping up to the counter and handing his boarding pass to the agent. Without recognizing him, the agent addressed him cheerfully, processed his seat, and waved him through. Connor, however, still wore a skeptical frown. Inside the terminal, once past security, Ryan headed for the first-class lounge. It was a quiet space with plush armchairs, discreet lighting, and a constant flow of complimentary drinks. Ryan settled into a corner seat, grateful for a moment of calm away from the bustling terminal. He took out a paperback novel, flipping it open to a dog-eared page. Connor strolled in minutes later, casting quick glances around the lounge. His gaze landed on Ryan, now absorbed in his book, and a flash of annoyance crossed his face. If Connor believed Ryan didn't belong here, it bothered him more than he cared to admit. He approached with forced casualness. "You're really flying first class?" he asked, half smirking. Ryan met his eyes, shutting the book. "That's right," he answered softly. Connor exhaled as if stifling a laugh. "Just not every day you see someone so, dressed down in this part of the airport." Ryan shrugged. "Clothes don't make the traveler, I guess." Boarding begins. Before Connor could respond, the lounge announcer informed them it was time to board. Connor grabbed his carry-on, a sleek designer bag, and walked toward the gate. Ryan followed at a leisurely pace, still wearing that relaxed, unassuming air. Entering the aircraft, a flight attendant greeted each passenger with a warm smile. She checked Ryan's ticket and led him to his seat, 3A, a spacious corner in the first-class cabin. Moments later, Connor arrived at 3B, setting his bag in the overhead compartment. Catching sight of Ryan, he paused in disbelief. "You're right next to me," he muttered, a forced smile on his lips. Ryan nodded, buckling his seatbelt. "Looks like it." Connor settled in with an audible sigh, exchanging a glance with a passing flight attendant as though to say, "Really? Him?" The attendant, oblivious to Connor's frustration, simply offered them pre-flight beverages. Turbulence of egos. As the plane taxied to the runway, Connor kept tapping at his phone, occasionally eyeing Ryan's battered paperback novel. He seemed both amused and annoyed that a man who looked so ordinary could afford to be in first class. Ryan, for his part, found the tension strange but said nothing, focusing instead on the hum of the engines. Just before takeoff, Connor leaned in, voice low. "So, mind if I ask what you do for a living?" Ryan closed the book. "I'm in the film industry," he replied neutrally. Connor's eyebrow quirked. "Actor? Producer? Or more like behind the scenes?" Ryan shrugged. "A bit of everything, I guess." Connor's mouth curved into an almost patronizing smile. "Must be a small production, right?" Ryan simply returned a polite nod, letting the question hang. He had no interest in flaunting his identity or picking a fight. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, he could sense Connor's skepticism rising. This was shaping up to be a very long flight, and neither one had the slightest inkling of how the journey would forever alter Connor's assumptions about status, success, and self-worth. As the plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the tension between Ryan and Connor seemed to fill the small space between their first-class seats. Around them, other passengers moved on from polite greetings and settled into the hush that always followed takeoff, some reading, others dozing off. Ryan reclined his seat just a fraction, hoping the quiet would last, but Connor's restless presence was hard to ignore. From the corner of his eye, Ryan saw the man shift in his seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine with exaggerated care before depositing it in the seat pocket with a sharp sigh. The flight attendant passed by, offering a second round of drinks. Connor requested another glass of champagne, and though he didn't say it aloud this time, his expression still spoke volumes, as if he believed Ryan was missing a grand opportunity by sticking to water. Ryan merely thanked the attendant, cradling his cup carefully while he looked out the window at the darkening sky. He tried to center his mind on simpler thoughts, perhaps the script he needed to review soon, or the upcoming meeting that had prompted this overnight flight in the first place. Yet, his thoughts kept wandering back to Connor's needling remarks. He was used to fans recognizing him, or to people forming opinions of him at first sight, but the man in seat 3B had a particular kind of dismissive air, one that left Ryan oddly unsettled. It wasn't anger he felt, but a sort of sadness that someone could be so fixated on appearances. Still, he saw no point in picking a fight. Let Connor think what he wanted. If it made the flight pass more peacefully, Ryan would let him talk himself into whatever conclusions he pleased. Eventually, the lights in the cabin dimmed for the overnight portion of the journey, and the attendant reappeared with a tray of small comforts: eye masks, lip balm, lavender-scented pillows. Ryan accepted an eye mask with a quiet thank you, but declined the pillow, preferring to lay his head back and watch the faint glow of distant cabin lights. On the other hand, Connor accepted everything with a flourish, adjusting his seat into a near-flat position. He fidgeted and glanced at Ryan often, as if expecting the kind of conversation that never came. Ryan recognized the signs of someone who wanted a reaction but didn't know how to draw it out of a man who found no thrill in an argument. An hour passed, maybe two, with the plane tracing a path through dark skies. Ryan scrolled absently through a few emails on his phone, using the in-flight Wi-Fi to check for any urgent messages. He found nothing pressing. A half-dozen seats away, a passenger recognized him, smiled, and gave a small wave. Ryan acknowledged it with a friendly nod, relieved she didn't try to approach. Connor noticed the exchange, his eyes narrowing. Ryan sensed the moment Connor's curiosity crested because the man closed his laptop, set it aside, and cleared his throat. "You're surprisingly comfortable up here," Connor said. "First class is a big expense for most people, you know." Ryan powered off his screen. "I suppose it depends on your priorities," he replied. "Some folks spend a lot on a car, some on a house, others on travel." Connor shrugged. "Sure, but you strike me as the type who'd normally be in coach. No offense, I just can't figure out why you're so casual about the cost." Ryan met Connor's gaze, reading the mixture of suspicion and genuine curiosity in his eyes. "I'm traveling for business," he said simply. "Sometimes you pay more for comfort if you have to arrive ready to work." Connor crossed his arms, letting the silence hang. For a moment, Ryan thought the conversation might end there, but Connor's restless energy persisted. "You said you're in film," Connor continued. "I keep wondering. Local commercials, maybe? Or corporate training videos? Something that pays enough for the occasional first-class flight, but not enough to bother dressing up." Ryan considered the question. If the man had recognized him, he might not be so brazen, so maybe he truly had no idea who he was speaking to. Ryan didn't fault him for that, but the insinuation still came across as condescending. "Let's just say I've done well," Ryan replied, voice measured. "But if you're hoping for me to talk about it in detail, I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm not looking to brag." Connor gave a short laugh. "Hey, bragging's not a crime. In my line of work, we close deals by showing what we've got. High-level clients need to see the watch on your wrist, the ring on your finger, the suit on your back. Otherwise, they won't even look at the contract." Ryan thought about that for a moment, recalling the times he'd attended premieres or galas in carefully chosen attire, not because he needed to show off, but because it was part of the dance of public appearances. He decided it wasn't worth explaining the difference, at least not yet. "It's a different approach," he acknowledged, keeping his tone polite. Connor eyed him, as though searching for a crack in his calm. "Yeah, maybe. But you can't deny results. My clients see me as someone they can trust because I dress the part of a man who knows success." Ryan placed his phone on the small tray table. "Dress can be a language, I agree, but it's not always the entire story, right?" Connor opened his mouth to retort, then hesitated. The overhead lights flickered, prompting both men to glance around, but it was merely the usual mid-flight adjustment. The flight attendant drifted by, offering a late snack. Connor declined, but Ryan accepted a small bag of pretzels and quietly thanked her. He popped one into his mouth and resumed gazing out at the dark sky. The hush between them grew. In that silence, Ryan sensed that Connor was struggling with conflicting ideas. On one hand, believing wholeheartedly in the power of external image, on the other, intrigued by Ryan's absolute lack of interest in proving himself. The plane flew on through the night, and for a time, the tension between them stabilized into an uneasy truce. Ryan closed his eyes, leaning his head back as the faint drone of the aircraft lulled him into an almost meditative calm. He had no doubt Connor would press him for more answers before the flight ended, but for now, Ryan was content with the quiet. What neither man realized was that in the not-so-distant future, a single unexpected moment would upend this precarious balance and challenge everything Connor believed about status and respect. As the flight pressed on through the night, the soft hum of the engines and the subtle shift of cabin lights announced that the journey was more than halfway done. Ryan stirred from a light doze, blinking to clear the heaviness in his eyes, and realized Connor was still awake. The man sat rigid in his seat, arms crossed, watching Ryan with an expression torn between curiosity and impatience. Beyond them, most of the first class had gone quiet, with many passengers dozing under blankets or scrolling through their phones with dimmed screens. The flight attendant drifted through the aisle, checking that everyone was comfortable, and paused by Connor's seat to offer him another refill of champagne. Connor waved her off, declining this time, and she moved on without a word. Ryan tugged at the corners of the thin airline blanket draped over him, folding it so he could sit more upright. As he did, he sensed Connor's resolve tighten. Perhaps the man had been waiting for him to wake up, or maybe he had spent the last hour rehearsing what to say next. In the hush of a nearly sleeping cabin, Connor's voice, though low, seemed to carry more weight when he finally spoke. "You're not exactly talkative," he remarked, tapping a restless pattern on the armrest. "But I figure you might have some interesting stories. People in your line of work usually do." Ryan turned to meet his eyes, noticing that Connor seemed less combative than before. "I don't mind conversation," he said softly. "I just prefer not to force it. The flight can be long enough without turning it into a debate." Connor nodded slowly, uncrossing his arms. "Fair enough," he said. Then he cleared his throat. "Look, I'll admit I've been curious about you. You're not dressed like the rest of us, you hardly touched your dinner, and you seem completely at ease in a place people normally go out of their way to flaunt. It's unusual." Ryan let a small smile play on his lips. "I'm just used to traveling quietly," he replied. "A lot of folks assume first class is about showing off, but sometimes it's just about comfort and time." Connor hesitated, as though weighing whether to ask something more direct. Finally, he decided to proceed. "So, is it true what you said earlier, that you do some acting and producing? I've been trying to place your face, and it's driving me nuts that I can't figure out if I've seen you somewhere." Ryan exhaled, the faintest trace of amusement in his expression. "I've had a few projects you might know, but you might also have missed them, depending on your tastes." Connor offered a tight laugh. "I see. Maybe you were in some smaller films, or experimental stuff. That would explain the anonymity." His words still held an edge of condescension, but at least he wasn't sneering anymore. He leaned back, fiddling with the business card holder in his breast pocket. "I guess we all hustle in our own ways," he added, somewhat resigned. Ryan nodded without comment, content to let that statement float between them. He studied Connor's profile, noticing lines of fatigue etched around the man's eyes, and realized that beneath the airs, Connor might just be weary, or searching for validation. The tension that had seemed so pronounced earlier now felt like it was fraying, replaced by something more akin to resignation. A muffled chime sounded through the speakers, prompting the flight attendant to appear again and announce that anyone who wished to stretch their legs could do so before the captain dimmed the cabin fully for rest. Connor took the cue to stand up, and Ryan followed. They stepped into the aisle, joining a few other drowsy travelers who were making their way toward the galley or the lavatories. One or two recognized Ryan, giving him nods or soft murmurs of greeting. Connor watched these exchanges with mounting confusion, as if the puzzle pieces were shifting into place. On his way back to his seat, Ryan felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. An older gentleman with a warm grin quietly thanked him for a past film he'd starred in, describing how it had resonated with him during a difficult time. Ryan smiled, expressing genuine gratitude. The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for Connor, who stood just behind them in the narrow aisle, to overhear. Connor's eyes went wide and a faint flush crept across his cheeks as he realized Ryan wasn't just some obscure indie actor. He glanced at the older gentleman and at Ryan, obviously piecing together that Ryan was more known than he had assumed. When they returned to their seats, Connor slowly buckled in, casting an uneasy glance in Ryan's direction. For a moment, he said nothing, brow furrowed as though wrestling with the new information. Then he cleared his throat, his voice softer than Ryan had ever heard it. "So, you're actually in bigger projects than I guessed, aren't you?" Ryan looked at him, studying the mixture of embarrassment and curiosity on the man's face. "I guess you could say that," he replied carefully. Connor inhaled, exhaling shakily, as if trying to hold on to a shred of dignity. "I've probably come across your name more times than I realize," he admitted. "I can't believe I didn't make the connection." Ryan shook his head. "It's okay. I don't go around announcing it to everyone. Flying under the radar is sort of nice." Connor stared at the fastened seatbelt sign overhead, the faint hum of the engines growing louder in the hush. "Listen," he started, stumbling over his words. "I realize I might have given you a hard time earlier. I just thought you were some guy trying to act like you belonged here. I didn't think. If I'd known." Ryan gently stopped him with an open palm raised. "You don't owe me an apology, because I'm recognized," he said quietly. "If anything, the way you treat a stranger you believe has no influence says a lot more about you than how you treat someone you know is famous." Connor's face fell, as though those words pricked him more deeply than any scolding ever could. He sank back into his seat, nodding once, struggling to form a response. The cabin around them was still dim, faint reading lights illuminating a handful of seats where passengers remained awake. "I guess I never thought of it that way," Connor said eventually, voice subdued. I guess I just assumed. That's how business is, you know? You see someone, you judge them, you figure out how they fit into your world." Ryan let the man's confession hang between them, then offered a small, empathetic nod. "We all make judgments. The question is, do we learn from them?" Connor gave a shaky chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck as if trying to release tension. "I'm learning right now," he said, half joking. This definitely wasn't how I expected the flight to go. For a while, they sat side by side without talking, letting the cabin's hush envelope them. Ryan flipped through a few more pages of the book he'd been reading, while Connor stared into the half-light, the expression on his face hinting at a swirl of thoughts. At one point, the flight attendant passed by again, and this time Connor asked for water instead of champagne, an almost comically small gesture, yet one that felt like a nod toward humility. The pilot's voice soon crackled over the intercom, announcing they'd begin their initial descent in about 20 minutes. Passengers stirred, adjusting their seats and blinking sleep from their eyes. Ryan tucked his book away and buckled his seatbelt again. Connor did the same, then slowly turned to Ryan one last time. "I might have come off like a jerk," he said quietly, "and maybe I was, but for what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not because of who you are, but because I realize that's not how I want to be, judging people without a clue. You said something earlier about how we treat strangers showing who we really are. I think I needed to hear that." Ryan studied the man's expression, seeing genuine regret there. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "I know it's not easy to own up to mistakes, especially when you're used to impressing people, but I appreciate it." Connor released a long breath, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I won't pretend I'm a changed man overnight, but I'll try to remember this. It's a lesson I've been ignoring for a while." Their conversation ended as the plane dipped through a bank of clouds, city lights shimmering below. By the time they touched down and taxied to the gate, the tension between them had eased into something almost cordial. Passengers started gathering their belongings from overhead bins. Connor offered to help Ryan with his backpack, a small gesture that Ryan accepted with a nod. Once they stepped off the aircraft, the crowd of first-class travelers dispersed into the terminal. Connor shook Ryan's hand, avoiding eye contact at first, but at the last-second meeting Ryan's gaze in a silent thanks. Ryan returned the handshake, mustering a gentle smile before sliding the strap of his backpack over his shoulder and heading toward baggage claim. He knew Connor would carry this encounter differently than if the roles had been reversed from the start, and maybe that was the point, that the best lessons are the ones we learn when we're caught off guard by our own misconceptions. In the terminal, a few people recognized Ryan and waved shyly, while others bustled past, eager to reach connecting flights or greet waiting friends. He nodded politely to each face turned his way, but he kept moving, the echoes of conversation with Connor still drifting through his mind. Connor, meanwhile, lingered near a newsstand, leaning against a pillar as though taking a moment to process everything that had happened. As Ryan left him behind, he couldn't help but feel that something small but important had shifted in the man's perspective. Whether Connor would hold on to that shift, Ryan couldn't know. The world had a way of pulling people back into old habits of judgment and superficial success. But for one flight, at least, they had shared a glimpse of something truer. In the end, Ryan walked away reminded that the quietest journeys often spark the most unexpected transformations. All it took was a chance meeting in seat 3A and 3B, somewhere high above the clouds, to reveal that appearances can both deceive and enlighten, and that anyone, no matter how certain they are of their worldview, can still be surprised by simple truths.